I'm Janet Wong. I'm the Associate Artistic Director of New York Live Arts, and we're very, very happy to be partnering with Dance NYC and hosting you today. We and Dance NYC are committed to creating a usable space here and to create what do you call this? Meaningful integration of disabled artists and audiences. And hosting this event today made us realize that we're not 100% usable. As you can see, even though our theater is fully accessible, our doors are not powered, our box office counters may be too high, so on and so forth. But with that said, I would invite you guys to come back again. Please pick up a brochure on your way out and come back to see performances here, to attend more panel discussions, and also on your way out, please write something on our wall. We just opened our installation last night called Say It Loud with Four Freedoms. Four Freedoms is the first artist-run super PAC, and Four Freedoms, as you can imagine, is inspired by Four Freedoms, Roosevelt. So go on downstairs and write down whatever you think and whatever you feel about the political process, okay? And we are here very happy to host this event, like I said. And without further ado, let me introduce Executive Director Lane Harwell of Dance NYC.
Thank you, Janet, and the whole team here at New York Live Arts for hosting us. It's not incidental that we're here at Live Arts. Bill T. Jones has a history of collaborating with disabled artists, and this place is big on ideas for moving New Yorkers forward. Tonight, as you know, is about disability, race, and forces of oppression that shape dance practice and scholarship. It's the second in an International Voices series that extends Dance NYC's commitment to a cultural ecosystem that expressly includes disabled artists. The series grows out of pioneering research, convening, and coalition building that Dance NYC has undertaken these past few years. And it puts our learning on the ground in New York with both national and international voices. I'm excited to say the series coincides with a new Disability Dance Artistry Fund that Dance NYC announced earlier this month. Established with support from the Ford Foundation, the fund will support integrated dance performances in the metropolitan area in the year ahead. The application is available. It's open online at dance.nyc, and it's open until October 25. We hope many of you will participate and share the news with dance makers who may be interested. The series also coincides with a national initiative and set of convening across the United States by Access Dance Company with the support of the national organization Dance USA, and Dance NYC works in alliance with Dance USA. I have many partners to thank for making tonight possible. Above all, I want to thank the series funders, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, the State Council on the Arts, and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, which is well represented here tonight, so welcome. I want to thank the volunteers and the staff working behind the scenes, especially Disability Dance Artistry Task Force, Dance NYC's Programs Manager, Alejandro Duque Cifuentes, and our new Equity and Inclusion Coordinator, Jay Soto, whom I hope you all will be able to meet tonight. And above all, I want to thank the amazing Alice Shepard, who will be moderating the session tonight, and our dear colleague, Simi Linton, for curating the series. And all they do to advance disability arts in New York City. A few logistical notes before I introduce Alice. First, you are being photographed and filmed tonight for archival purposes. Second, you can help us extend the conversation on Twitter tonight using the handle @DanceNYC and the hashtags Town Hall and DDA Voices. Third, to learn more about tonight's speakers and the series, please visit dance.nyc/DDA bios and dance.nyc/DDA series. Finally, the event tonight will consist of a conversation between Dr. Amy Meredith Cox and Dr. Carrie Sandal, moderated by Alice Shepard, followed by a question and answer session. If you have questions, we will invite you to line up at a microphone that I believe will be stationed here. We'll let you know. Or if you prefer to post your question online, you can send it by email to ddatownhall@dance.nyc, and someone on our team will try to put the question forward to the speakers. So, with those few notes, it is my honor to introduce our moderator this evening. I asked her what I should tell you about her, and she said, just let them know I'm fantastic. Which is true. And Simi's laughing. So Alice is a dancer, a choreographer, an academic, and an activist. And it seems to me she is just about everywhere and focused on race, gender, and disability issues. Alice is also, I keep trying to turn around, Alice is also a member of the Dance NYC Board of Directors, and in that role is always moving me and the organization forward, as I know she will with all of us tonight. Thank you, Alice, for your leadership. Thank you all.
Thanks for coming. Let's get started. It's an honor to be here with Amy and Carrie, whose friendship and tussling with these issues was really forged back in a project known as the Anarcho Project, where they really began to grapple with issues of race and disability. My first question to both of you is, what are some of the benefits and the risks of putting race and disability together in this kind of environment? I don't know. Take it away, Amy.
Okay, so I'm just so happy to be here and have this conversation. I want to say first and foremost, and I think can I start with risks, because I think I like to start in that place, and I think that whenever we are talking about any sort of identity or subjectivity that is not normative in the ways that we have come to define it, right? That is not sort of white and male and heterosexual, and we could go on and on and on. There's always the risk that in asserting yourself, right, in taking up space, in giving voice to, and all those words we like to use when we talk about artistic expression, that your action is always in reaction to something else, right? You know what I mean? Like everything you do is resistance. Everything you do is speaking back to this larger power structure. And so when I think about race in that way, right? Race, especially in this moment where rightfully so, the ways that we understand race is in this oppositional space, and I think we're leaving a lot out. And within the conversation about access and space and race, we're doing a bad job of thinking about how disability fits into the equation of access and fits into how we think about what it means to occupy space and what it means to occupy space in a way that is sustainable. So what I mean by that is that when we talk about occupying space and what is a safe space for someone else, which might be a dangerous space for another person, Never, well, it's rarely talked about in terms of you being a full person, right? It's only that part of you that's black, or that part of you that's disabled, or that part of you that is seen as is the forefront of your identity that's responding to something that's oppressive. And so when I think about talking about race and disability in the same conversation, I worry that a couple of things are happening, that we are expanding the conversation about access without fine-tuning the ways that we understand how it plays out differently for different people, right? And I think that we are assuming, if we put in the same sentence race and disability, that we're providing or we're engaging in an intersectional analysis when we in some ways are just layering identities without really understanding how they intersect, right? I think in many ways, there's a danger of reinforcing the category in a way that is even more constraining.
So, Carrie?
Yes to everything Amy said. I think that the word access means so many different and specific things. So in the disability movement, we think about access as inclusion, as being openings being offered so that we can join the, I guess we'd call that the non-disabled world. So to join the non-disabled world, what happens is that there's this concept of reasonable accommodation. And that if something can be changed and we can be let in, then there's this idea that there's a level playing field. There are all these metaphors that are embedded in these as well. And that if we're on that level playing field, then we should be able to compete. And what is not acknowledged in that sort of thinking is it's not about just being let in. Being let in is only one part of it, but it's also about then what is expected of you once you're in. And often it is to adapt or to adjust to what is already set in place. So whether that's architecture, in terms of the arts, my background is in theater and performance studies, but I'm very interested in physically integrated dance and also disability dance. But what happens is that there are very standardized forms that have developed on certain standardized bodies over centuries that just don't make sense for disabled people. Or that there are adaptations made that then when our bodies are in those choreographic spaces, then it's almost like we will always fail. That we'll always be judged in approximation to the non-disabled norm. So we're there, but it's not really about creating from our own unique identities, aesthetics, and experiences, which is always intersectional. So I think that that is a huge danger, and I think that what his focus on inclusion is not considering is the times when we need to be in spaces where disability and all of our other identities that are intersecting are at the center. Not that we're in someone else's space that we're having to adapt to, but what happens when we're together and we're exploring who we are. We can't come to a level playing field when we don't have something to bring to the table that's uniquely ours. And so this is kind of one of the tensions, I think, that comes up.
And you mentioned failure, which I think is really important to talk about as well. When we talk about, well, what does it mean then to succeed? And in what arena are we talking about success or failure? And I think that what tends to happen when we feel like we're continually looking to access space or looking for inclusion, and even the word integration, it means something different, obviously, for each of us, but especially when we're thinking about the distinction between, and there's a huge distinction between a racialized identity and what, in terms of how we think about disability or ability and access in that way. And so we can talk about embodiment and the way that the body is read in space, given those distinctions, but it's going back to dangers, which is that we can't equate them, but we also can't tease them apart. It's difficult, right? Because I'm challenging myself as I'm thinking about what you're saying, Carrie, and to think about, so then what does failure look like in terms of how we use these terms together? And I think that failure can look like oversimplifying or universalizing exclusion. But at the same time, I do think it's necessary to create links and solidarity so that you can push back against. And so this is what I'm constantly moving back and forth with thinking about, like, how do you dismantle, right? And when you think about dismantling, whatever that is, whatever power structure you're talking about, or whatever lack of access, whatever we're talking about, when you're trying to dismantle, you need collectives, you need bodies, you need power, you need quantity, you need number, right? But what's dangerous with that is that in whatever you're tearing apart is easily built back up when you have not accurately articulated what the exclusion is, right? Or the difference between the ways that we experience, for example, space, or the difference between the ways that our bodies are read in different contexts. And so and I think failure is important because I don't think we've accurately defined what success looks like.
Can we define what success looks like?
Well, I would say that our failures are also successes, because one of the things that we haven't been allowed to do is have the dignity of risk. That disabled people are often, that things are done for us, or decisions are made about where we can go and what we can do. And part of the background here is that Amy and I worked on this 3-year project in which we were grappling with these issues, and there were things that would come up that we would only know from having been in this space working together, trying to find common ground and realizing our assumptions were not at all what would work. But we wouldn't have known that unless we had had our own space to take risks with one another, and also that we made a commitment to staying through some of the difficult times. So to just be more specific, I'll give you one example. So the being watched. And if we're artists and we're asking people to look at us, and we're creating something that is inviting a certain type of gaze, that has different implications for people coming from differently marked identities. So one of the immediate points of tension that came up between certain white disability activist communities and certain black feminist communities, many of whom did not have disabilities or did not identify with disability, was this way that a lot of white disabled people, that our form of activism has been to kind of own our shame and then push it back in a really in-your-face sort of way. So if we're talking about something that has been put onto us, maybe sexual objectification or infantilization, there's some really obnoxious, over-the-top, in-your-face aesthetic that's been adopted to push that back. And then what was happening when we were working on issues together, the black feminist activists were saying, wait a minute. You want to take it from that?
No, you can go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And so thinking about shame, this is another point of tension and another danger, is that the strategies that we use don't have the same consequences.
Right.
And so in this moment, when we're thinking about how do you respond to a narrative that has constrained you, right? And one way to respond to it is to push back at it so hard, right? To expose it, to like in a very over the top way. And for a lot of communities of color, especially for black women, that level of exposure is can lead to shame, can leave you unprotected. We talked a lot about what it means to protest in a way that deals in subterfuge, that deals in secrets, that hides in dark spaces to create a sort of resistance. And so that as a strategy does not necessarily work in a different community. And so part of the danger is not fully engaging or understanding the ways that those different strategies can have really dire and dangerous consequences for another community. But the main point that I want to point out is where you started. We would not have known that if we had not engaged one another in practice, and not just in conversation like we're sitting here, but in practice. Moving together, writing together, going to other like university and community spaces and getting non-dancers to dance with us. Being uncomfortable 99.9% of the time, like really uncomfortable. And I think that's important. I don't think that much can happen that leads to change if you're not experiencing some level of discomfort, right? If there's not a way, whether, huh? So we were uncomfortable a lot of the time. And yeah. Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just pick on all of these threads for a second? So, I mean, I want to notice how careful you are about acknowledging that there is a risk of missing the intersection, but also like naming it for the two separate communities without actually talking about the intersections. Mm-hmm. So I want to like name that. I mean, for someone who lives in both intersections, so like that's part of that discomfort, and to notice that discomfort is important. But the how you get through that is the next part of that question. And I know you've had a lot of practice at doing that. Can you talk a little bit about language and limitations and how do you're here, you're willing to do this. How do you manage to language all of this experience, and what about terminologies that will get us to bring these things together, or not? Like to mark the distinctions, mark the boundaries, and know when to keep out.
Well, I think with our particular collaboration, we made, it was like practically ceremonial commitment to one another that we were going to stay together to the end of this project no matter how angry we got with one another. And sometimes that commitment is what got us through. No matter how many times our feelings were hurt, or who hated us, who was sending us hate mail, there was this assumption that we cared for one another through all of that. And I think that was important, and that we were creating something new that didn't have a language, and that's why it was uncomfortable. Because until your body was doing something with another body and the difference emerged, then you could name it. But until it emerged through these uncomfortable workshops or movement spaces or poetry we'd be writing together, how do we even know it exists? So we would make these discoveries, all these emotions would come up, then we would have to name it, and then how do you represent that for someone to look at? So that was like a process.
How do you, the people in this room weren't in that practice, how do you establish a frame for the audience here? Like what kinds of, where's your terminology? How do you set it up for all of you?
So part of what was really difficult as part of this process, and this is what you're pushing back against, and what was really frustrating for me, is that I felt like we were able to come up with a vocabulary and a terminology that worked for us. And I don't know if you agree with this, Carrie, but that worked for us internally. But I don't know how successful, and this is just from my perspective, it was in terms of communicating beyond our collaborative. And I don't know if that necessarily matters. And I say this because of this. And I say this because, and you can push back, I hope you do, but what I'm thinking about is maybe it's not so much the terminology or a blueprint that emerges from a process like this, or having these difficult conversations, or using new choreographic processes and ways of being that enabled us to get through those uncomfortable moments. But the process itself can be taken to a different community, can be used in different contexts. And maybe it's not about telling a community, a diverse community that comes together to deal with whatever the issue is, right? How they should do it. But each process will generate something different in that space and will be useful for that community. So that's part of my answer. But I also do think, and pushing back against myself, that we need methods, we need terminology. And I guess what I'm speaking to is how difficult that is, or how difficult it was for us, and how difficult obviously it is for me in this moment. But I want to suggest that Is there something beyond or in something beyond language and something beyond method that enables us to get at something different? You know what I mean? Is there a practice that is larger than that, right? And maybe it's even more esoteric, but enables something different to happen. So we're talking about how do we create new language, how do we create new methods to get at a different place, and maybe we need to think differently about what we define as language and what we define as a method. I mean, I don't have the answer.
Well, and I
but, you know.
think that part of what would happen then, and what I have seen in disability arts in general, in terms of audience response and critical response, is I will have seen something incredibly complex and interesting and something new that doesn't seem like it's referencing any sort of non-disabled form. And if it's not in reference to, then it's something else and it's hard to have language. But when you read the criticism about any of this work, most of the time, I would say 90% of the words allotted to a review will be about the reviewer reckoning with the idea that the performer is a human being. I mean, just it gets to that ridiculous level that we will have shown them like months and years of effort of this intense collaboration, and then you'll get, you know, that we've found a common humanity. And so no, that is not what we were talking about at all. And then there will be maybe any analysis will end up being description of what happened, like the equivalent of plot summary. And so it's so disappointing too to put some new things out into the world, but then also, as Amy and I talked about this with Alice too, we get so deeply inside it that we assume that it's going to communicate when we have to realize other people are new to the conversation. But then does that mean we stop because what we're doing because other people need to catch up? I don't know. But I can tell you that it can be so painful to be read in such a restrictive way that it can almost feel like you should stop, you know. So, or else just the other response that we've come to is to stop caring what the audience thinks, which is really against all my training as a theater artist. But really, like, okay, in Chicago, the group of artists that we're working with, we've decided that we are not going to explain disability to audiences. We're done with that question. What we're going to do is we're going to work together and we're going to move things where we want it to go, and what the audience gets what it's going to get. And we're going to put things in our work that other disabled people are going to recognize. But I think that also, that's another risky choice, because then it can alienate audiences. They're like, this is just so weird, I don't know what it is. So,
I'm just holding on to all of these threads, and I want to begin to read them back again. So, I mean, partly there's an audience response question, like, you know, literally, how are you read? If there's an absence of language, well, how does audience interpretation, critical interpretation work? And yet there's also what seems to me right now has been a more pressing question that both of you have raised about access and being its own aesthetic, and also about, you know, how do we define aesthetics and what aesthetics can emerge when we're not constantly using the vocabulary of or being framed by, conceptualized by these able-bodied Eurocentric ideals. So can you talk a little bit about what emerges? What is access when it is its own aesthetic? And yeah.
I think it's important to think about access, and I think this is, again, risky, and we're talking about who our audience is. I think it's also important to name who we're trying to create access for. So what does it mean to create movement, create dance, and to be less concerned with how you're read in a normative way, but how what you're doing speaks to a marginalized community, for example. So maybe your movement vocabulary or the aesthetics of the context in which the movement is performed does not speak to your mainstream audience, however we want to define that. But in performing that, non-mainstream work or in disrupting that space, you're creating access for another community. And I think that's where we can think about how access gets open, how we even change what we think of as access. So maybe I'm not trying to create space so that I can come in and be integrated or incorporated, but I'm doing something over here that creates a larger space for folks who can't get here and create the methods that that we've been talking about. And so, I don't know, I mean, I'm thinking as I'm talking and thinking that in the challenge to think about how do we name things, how do we create a blueprint, I don't know that it happens in these mainstream spaces. I don't think, like if we think about protest history, whatever protest history we want to name, it wasn't in that mainstream space, might have been where the performance happened. Do you know what I mean? Like the performance. But in terms of generating something new and generating something potentially disruptive, it didn't necessarily happen in that space. Do you know what I mean? Like it happened in these other spaces that were then expanded to bring in folks who aren't normally a part of this conversation. So maybe it's, you know, we should be less concerned with how do we get access to these spaces and how do we create different spaces for ourselves. And how does that vocabulary that we're using speak to folks who don't have the language that can be recognized in these other spaces? So then we're generating something, we're cooking, we're generating something over here, right? And what that becomes, ultimately, is what becomes a disruptive act. So we're not fighting to move into here, but there's other spaces.
And in those other spaces, I think one of these the radical things is having access to each other's bodies and access to each other's experiences. Because when we were working together, people aren't, there's this way in which we are not allowed to touch one another. Physically, emotionally, these secrets that we have about our bodies or about our own communities. So, for instance, if we have people with disabilities and one of our values is interdependence and working with one another to meet someone's access needs, then how does that become part of the piece itself? And we did that a lot with an ARCA project. But that can only happen if you break that barrier and say, let's spend some time touching each other. Not in terms of like a touchy-feely, woo-woo thing, although I think that happened. But in terms of, there's so many barriers that are put between us. People aren't allowed to stare at disabled people, so then they don't see us. So when we come together in collaboration and someone hasn't even been allowed their whole life to look at you, and then you're asking them to look, there's a whole process. And then you start doing movement exercises together where you're asked to hold someone's hand, and someone's hand might not be able to reach out to yours. So then you have to figure out, what does holding your hand mean? That can only happen with access to each other that is enabled by some sort of frame. Mm-hmm. You have something you're thinking.
I'm thinking, but let me ask you, I mean, my thought is to ask you, so I was thinking, my thought is to ask you how permission, like how do you give permission, and what happens when others take permission? And, you know, it's one thing to have access in a process, and it's another thing to be on stage and to have that permission taken such that, you know, people begin to talk about the body. And that is, well, I mean.
Well, I can only answer your question with an example.
Go for it.
So we've been working on projects in Chicago that are trying to incorporate disability access into the aesthetic of whatever piece is being created. So instead of having add-on audio description of what's visually happening, or add-on American Sign Language interpreting, that's, you know, over separate from what we're doing. How do we incorporate those elements into a piece? And then that transgresses all kinds of boundaries, because then it feels like you might be appropriating another person's language, another person's disability. That has been really rocky. And then there's so many assumptions that happen, but unless we're able, and so many things that go wrong. But again, it's all about this process of figuring it out. And that's why I think I started off with this idea of, yes, inclusion is great. It's so amazing to have these spaces open up. But at the same time that we have inclusion, we also need whatever grouping of people that you're going to have together can have some time to work some things out, so that we have something then to show, some things that we've gone through that are difficult. Because there's also an assumption that we might want access to the space, but we might not want to do ballet, or we might not want to do a tango, or we may, but we don't know, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is not answering your question. I'm just thinking, I just wanted to push to, and I'm pushing myself to go to a different place, because I wonder if I really want to force this conversation, and because I'm trying to, in my mind as we're talking, I'm like, are we talking about race and disability? Do you know what I mean? And it's so hard, but I want to offer a challenge, and so don't get mad. Can I just bring this out here? So so when we're talking about the way that we started off talking about non-normative identities in a broad way, and so how do we talk about race and disability in the same frame when we're thinking about dance specifically? And so, but when I think about race, when I think about disability in the context of art, and we're talking about aesthetics, I wonder how this underlying focus, and I'll just speak for myself as a Black scholar and artist, this underlying focus of protest, even in the beginning I said, we don't always want to be resisting against, is the this underlying aesthetic of protest that continues to show up, and also this underlying aesthetic which is closely related of struggle. And I was just thinking about that, Carrie, when you mentioned the hard parts, and we've been talking about this project that we worked on together, and the hard and the difficulty and the moving through and the discomfort. And there's something in me that feels as if the way to really create something new that is transformative in and beyond the spaces that we occupy and that we can't even yet imagine is to think about moving beyond what I think is an underlying ethos of struggle, disruption. And that's an important part of it, right? And the fact that our bodies even show up in spaces can be a source of disruption, but I'm wondering how, I guess it's my question, I don't mean to ask the question, but I guess I'm wondering how an aesthetics of protest or an underlying aesthetics of struggle impacts our work, impacts the legibility of it, impacts the impact of it, whatever impact we want it to have, whether that's an artistic intervention or a community intervention. I'm just wondering, I think about that a lot, because as much as I in my work try to create from a place that is really generated from beyond that place of struggle and protest, it continues to show up. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, but I guess my question is, what does that aesthetics, that underlying aesthetics of protest and struggle mean for how we even understand aesthetics in the first place in our work? And can I just give an example? Yes. Okay, so for example, you mentioned when the critics see the work and you're just naming someone as human, right? Like the whole review was about you're a human being, right? And I kept thinking, so forgive me because this is gonna be really don't get messy and sloppy and all this, but when you were saying that, I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. And there's a segment of a critique against this movement which says, why are we still in a place where we have to say Black Lives Matter? Why are we still talking about I can't breathe, right? And so there's an elder in my community, Black woman, who's been all up and through the civil rights movement, and she said, in my time we wouldn't say I can't breathe. We would say not only can I breathe life into your whole civilization, right? So this idea that always coming from a place of injury or a place of I am a man, I can't breathe, is not only does it in some ways, this is a criticism of it, not only does it in some ways not empower a movement, so we're talking about a protest movement, but I'm wondering, and I'm not assuming that this is what's happening in all of our work, but how does that impact the way that we think about our artistic practices? And so I know that has been a focal point of the work that I've done as a dancer and a choreographer and that I've been a part of. And I don't know if people can see past that or if we are able effectively or if I have been able effectively to move past that protest to create something.
So can I
That could
re-ask
be
that
better.
question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can I offer a suggestion? I think what I have learned in response to this is, in our excitement to create something new out of our own uniqueness, aesthetics, and coming together of these differences, we forget what people are bringing with them. So, for instance, when we are doing any work, any movement, anything we bring with us is also informed by all of our other experience. That also needs to be honored and incorporated. And so we were doing a collaboration with a Black church in Chicago, and they are working on, it's a queer Black church. They're an interesting civil rights-based church, and they wanted to make their church accessible to people with disabilities, and so we collaborated doing it through the arts. And so we came together, and our questions were, what is disability? And they had all these aspirations to include disability, and then they would say they didn't have disabled people in their church. And we would say, really? We don't have any disabled artists in our church. Well, then as we started to work together, there was like, oh, wait a minute, there's a guy with CP in your choir who's singing, he's disabled. And they would say, oh, he's not disabled. And so they had all these people with disabilities, but yet there was not a recognition of their disability because it was also an identity that they didn't want to take on. He's just David. He's not disabled. Or the elders in the community who had, hearing devices or walked with, they're singing gospel music and they're disabled. So what is it that we already have in that moment that we're not even recognizing is already there?
Right.
So that was what we were learning from each other, is we're already bringing stuff together instead of, there's stuff that's already there, that we have stuff to build on that isn't always about the struggle, but just about the recognition that there is something really unique. I mean, I went to that church, and I'm a, if you can believe it, there is such a thing as a lapsed Unitarian Universalist. I had to, I know, it's like, you can't believe it, but I had to leave the church that I was going to because it was so unimaginative about the way that disability was incorporated, and they could not. So this other church that was opening itself up, trying to bring things in, and not even recognizing how far ahead they already were.
So
those are specific.
I'm hearing like a real recognition to look within, to recognize what's already there, to not necessarily move towards the mainstream, but to take those spaces, be in those spaces, make the spaces work as they happen, and to really see through, to allow those aesthetics register. I mean, you began, Amy, by not saying, maybe we don't always have to come from this place of throwing it back. So when you begin to mess, sort of, I'm a merger, and so I'm beginning to put all these threads together to see if there's a fabric. And I don't think there is. I mean, I think it's a pretty holy thing.
Right.
And that's a generative moment, that we talked about success and failure. The holes in the fabric are our successes, because that is the way forward. But I also want to pay attention to your old thing, like, how are we talking about race and disability? So let me then ask you that. Like, really, how are we talking about race and disability as we are thinking about dance and dance practice? I mean, how?
Well, part of it is that, and you and I have debated this before, is we have to be able to talk about the body and describe it, and also the identities that are not visible. And that is so incredibly uncomfortable, because if in the disability rights movement, some of the initial impulses were not to talk about impairment, but to focus on our political and social identity. And then the artists come in and say, my body is my medium, and I want everybody to look at my body now. So we're getting all these mixed messages. But even, in the piece I was talking about earlier of incorporating aesthetics, incorporating audio description, my students and I were looking at a video of Lynn Manning's called Shoot, that we had another African-American audio describer describe. And when we were watching it, we had some blind students with us as well. There was the piece Shoot is about race and disability. It's about being blind and being black. But the audio describer would very rarely describe the race of the people, of the characters. But yet the description of the characters was central to the meaning. And also, very rarely described the actual physicality of the people on the screen. So Lynn Manning's face has a particular way that his eyes moved, the way that they looked, the way the camera made a close shot on them that gave the audience information about, oh, at first you don't recognize he's blind, then there's this extreme close-up where you see the uniqueness of his eyes. But the audio describer could not bring himself to describe that. So when we were asking our blind students, and then we were talking about it, we asked this one student, did you realize that this character was white? Because it was very significant that this particular character was white and also a woman. And that information wasn't given by the audio describer. And she comes from a marginalized community in Chicago, and she said that would have made all the difference if I had known that that's what was there. So even if within our own world we can't bring ourselves to describe what's there, we can show it in a visual image and assume people will get it, but yet we can't say this. I know that makes you really uncomfortable too.
It does.
It makes you really uncomfortable. Because our audio describer's like, I've been taught my whole life not to describe disabled people, and then I'm supposed to describe the work to other disabled people, and I'm not disabled. But I'm black. Okay.
So,
I don't know.
yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, I think about most of the work that I do is really thinks a lot about race and space and gender as well. And even in that context, how difficult it is for us as artists, and as well as for the audience members or the reviewers or whoever it is, to name more than one identity category, right? It's like, how do you make sense of all of this? How does this all happen at once? And I wonder if, as we experience our lives and we live in these bodies, if we are able to really articulate what it means to occupy all of these categories. I mean, we can use fancy words like intersectionality, but what does that really feel like, right? And it is hard to, how do you produce art that speaks to that intersection? I think it's really difficult. Because we walk through this world first and foremost as human beings, right? Although we are impacted in all these varying ways by how we are read in the world. But it's so context dependent in many ways, right? What happens to me as a black woman in New York Black Arts that's read a certain way is different from what happens when I leave here, walk down the street, is different from what happens when I'm in Bed-Stuy. And so how do we, when we think about our intersected identities, and when we talk about race and disability, for example, specifically, I don't know if we're able to get specific, and I think that example of the interpreter is a perfect example of that. Like, how much not only can you see, how much can you read, how much can you, even in one body experience, and accurately articulate and express, precisely because it is intersected. And then we end up in this conundrum of talking about categories again and recreating these categories. I mean, I feel like I'm so pessimistic, but I guess I just really struggle with this. How do we, I guess the question I'm asking is, how do we articulate those intersections?
Can I ask you to take a moment's pause? I believe we are really close to time. So, yeah, no, we just started. So the last question hanging in the air is, can you just repeat that last question? How can we really articulate those things? Those intersections.
Yeah.
And so let's just take a moment and make that the final question that each of you pose the other. How do you personally articulate those intersections? And then we'll take the breath and open it up to the audience.
Why did I pose that question?
Well, I think that there's also an assumption that if one inhabits one particular clearly marked identity, one is separate from another's identity. And I think about especially disability in terms of relationship. So it's not a singular thing that one person has. The disability experience is about what happens when we are in relation with one another, whatever bodies we're bringing together. So it's not like people who are not disabled don't have disability experience, but we have to figure out what that is. Same with race, and this is where it starts to get, where the complication arises. And because my children are African American and they are disabled, I have learned so many things from being in relationship with them as their mother in public. And my son is 14 years old, he's 6'2", and he has severe mental illness. And it's very obvious to me when we are moving through the world together how he is perceived, how I am perceived, how that relationship is something in and of itself. And that, so it's like, okay, I'm a small white blonde lady, hold up, but I know something specific through my relationship with my son. I don't know his experience. I don't know I can't assume to know his community's experience or all the things he's experienced, but I do know something. And you know something significant about all disability. There are times when they're in the same body, and then there are times when they're in different bodies, but in relation. And is that relation also an intersection? That's my answer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to take the easy way out and say I don't know. I do think that it comes through maybe not being able to articulate the intersection, but being able to articulate your experience and how that experience is very much context dependent, historically dependent. And if we're talking specifically about artwork that is produced, I think the ways that we really see those intersections come to life is through the specificity of an experience,
that we can't describe.
articulating an experience. Yeah, but I think when we think about not just narratives, but maybe articulating an event. I think when you were talking about relationships, relationality, but also what happens in a particular moment. Right, so if we're able to, and I think about great writers who, the level of detail, and what does it mean to create that level of detail in our bodily practices? What does that look like? What does it mean to be specific? What does it mean to name the particular context? And then do we start to get at how these overlapping and intersected identities impact us as human beings and make us human? I don't know, I do think that the way that we began to see that was in relationship, right? And to see not only the connections that we have between these separate bodies, but then what is my relationship to you? Tell me about myself, right? And my own, the parts of myself that I might not even yet be able to name,
Right.
Through my relationship to you. So I would say that detail is important, being specific is important, and not just in terms of those interactions between separate bodies, but in terms of what happens in experience, in context, in detail.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you.
Oh, there was a line there.
Alejandra, are you running?
No.
order?
So I will explain in a second. Two? Okay, everyone. So because we do want to capture people asking questions and we want to make sure that we get it on the mic, we're going to put the mic here and people are welcome to come up to it. You can also email your questions to ddaTownHall@DanceNYC if you prefer for one of us on staff to ask the question on your behalf. So this is the space.
Where should we base? Base the speaker. Got it, thank you. Thank you all, that's very exciting. Of the three elements jumping around the room here, disability, dance, and race, we know that the conversation about disability and race is very rarely engaged in public forums. And I'd like to ask you to focus on what is the opportunity that dance provides to make this conversation happen. Is there something specific about dance? And kind of with that, what are the dangers of locating that conversation solely in the body? Because that would seem to then discount the social positioning and the power relationships that are embodied, to use that as a not real body, but idea, body, the body of an idea. What does dance provide, and what can we do to avoid, in that nexus of those three, locating that discourse just about bodies, if that wasn't too loaded. Thank you.
I recently spoke at my Association for Theater and Higher Education, and I had to tell them that I was no longer a theater professor, but did disability studies. And also I told them, I had to break up with them. I had to break up with theater because I fell in love with dance. And also theater, we have movement classes, we have lots of movement in theater. But I said dance is so far ahead of what's going on in theater. And I think that has something, so I'm answering your question by saying what is wrong with what I've found in theater is that the focus on narrative and pinning narrative and to the specific bodies and forcing disability to signify something significant to a plot point to move the narrative forward is a representational burden that you can almost never escape within what's currently going on in theater. And I feel like dance is about the body, but there's also narrative throughout. I just had to, so I don't know, is dance the body? Is body?
Well, I mean, I think, the first part of your question to me, I was going to say, yes, it works because dance focuses on embodiment in the body, and then you said something else which is totally about that. And that's dangerous, right? And so I think part of what I think is important in terms of thinking about dance, and specifically how dance might open up space for us to really have a conversation about race and disability, is that is there a way to see the body as not just something that is always being read by somebody else and always being objectified and thinking about the gaze, but does dance, and I think it does, allow space to see the body as what is possible, right? What is possible in terms of what the body can do, what is possible in terms of the ways that we can imagine bodies differently. And so my part of what I think is really important is that dance, I believe, can provide us with the opportunity to think about the gaze differently and to name bodies. Is there a way to name bodies or to see bodies without rarefied, without creating a narrative around them or stereotyping them? But I think dance allows that. I think dance allows for possibility. Dance allows for different ways of articulation and for a different way of seeing and understanding.
So can I just pull that back and re-nest that in the other conversation? That is precisely the answer that is in some ways the non-protest answer, right? I mean, because you were talking about coming from a place of not being in that struggle, and that steps out of the struggle of dance is about the normative body, and here are these other bodies that have been stigmatized and pushed out of the field, and then they're just right there. You came from that place of dance as a lens that enables us to move forward in our thinking and then analyze a whole bunch of other things. So right there.
Oh, so you added to one question.
Sorry?
It was like response to the protest question.
Yeah, it's exactly like you, so that's exactly in your own thinking of you asked how do I do it, and then just right there you just did it.
Yeah, and I do think I'm not saying that it's not without danger, right? Because we can't understand what they are seeing or understand what they are feeling. But I'm hopeful in the sense that there's something about the body, the language of the body, which might provide us with a different terminology than the language of the text. I think there's potential.
Second part of the question? Yeah, minds. The locating of the bodies versus the minds. Second part of the question.
Locating.
Yeah.
So that theater text narrative is more mind?
No, Simi's question has about the risk of locating it in the body and to the possible exclusion of minds.
No, the possible exclusion of talking about social positioning.
To this possible exclusion of talking about social positioning. Yeah.
I don't think that's possible. I think that that whenever our bodies are moving together in space and we're watching them, the sedimented meanings of struggle, of social positioning, of all those other narratives, experiences, relationships are already there. But they're not being simplified necessarily. It depends on, it's not all dance, it depends on what piece we're talking about. But that there are more multiple meanings available to audiences to read, which I think is when I get frustrated with theater, that theater sometimes can be so constrictive about locating a meaning and an impairment as a metaphor that in a piece we were doing at a former university that shall go unnamed, a cast member in a play broke his leg during the run of the show, and there was no understudy, and the director did not know what to do, because what would the audience think? They'd be confused. Why is this so-and-so on crutches? It's not in the play. No, it's not mentioned. So I said, well, just, they consulted me as the disabled person. I said, well, can you just be on crutches and know what the solution was? And Samuel French, don't listen. The director added a scene to the play in which this character had substance abuse issues. So the part that was added was that due to the substance abuse, he had fallen down the stairs and broken his leg. And so then the disability took on a moral meaning within the context of a play. Like he's so, addicted that he injures his body. And then that adds on to his own shame. So you see what I mean? It's like people cannot even conceive, and it's not even about the equivalent of colorblind casting or in terms of disability. It's almost like it can't be there. But in dance, I haven't seen that as much. What I have seen is people going to the program. What is that person? Is that person really disabled? What happened to that person? They're trying to find the information in the narrative, but it's not the same as in theater. Maybe.
Do I have to state my name and all of that? Is this going on any?
Just
Thank you. Aren't we addressing some of the issues that the choreographers in the community who are the or the dance maker, for example, and depending on if you're making a piece, depending on what your piece is about, that would be something that you would do in the casting. But I hope that now that we're having these discussions related to dance, disability, and race, I mean, if a woman of color who is a dancer and a choreographer and an artist wants to make something, Who's stopping her from doing that? And if she feels that her issue of color is an important part of that process, that's going to come up in the choreography that you choose. Same for you. I don't know whether you have a disability or not, and nor do I care. But in the choices that the dance makers are making, be it about race, about disability, about gender, about anything. I mean, if you're going to make a dance work about the Civil War, there are going to be a variety, a racial variety there. And depending on what point of view you are taking as the creator of the piece is really going to inform all of the cast of characters. I mean, if you want to cast it non-traditionally, say like Hamilton did, I think an audience can be brought along, especially in the disability arena. We have a further way to go to finally get the critics to stop calling us spunky cripples, and isn't it wonderful that we've overcome so much, and I'd like them to look at the dance work a little bit more than the fact that we use a wheelchair. So I want to put it back to you as the creator of the piece, or you as the creator of the piece. How are you going to think about that moving forward?
Well, while you were talking, what came to mind was the Olympics and gymnastics and women's gymnastics, and how much this gymnastics, you know, you could say that there's set choreography, but when it's inhabited by different bodies, that becomes a topic of discussion, whether it is framed that way or not. And so I think that's what I was saying, it's always already there, and I think the choreography can work with all of the available elements, and I'll let the choreographer will speak more clearly to that. But I think what my point is that you can have one standard form for all bodies in the gymnastics, and almost all the conversation will be about the race and the hair of the people doing the gymnastics.
Yeah, and I appreciate the question and the prompt, because I do think it's important to think about the choices that you make as the creator. But at the same time, regardless of what your motivations are, what your intention is in creating a piece and presenting a piece, you cannot, and we talked about this earlier, you can bring people along, right? You can create space for people to think differently about race or think differently about disability. But I think what we're trying to untangle here is that very question of how, no matter what, you're read in a certain way, right? Or the ways that a narrative that you create, a piece that you create, is still being created within a certain social landscape. And so how do you continue to do what you're saying, create in ways that push against those standardized ways of seeing bodies, of understanding the possibility of bodies? And it's not just about what do we do as audience goers, of course, right? So it's imperative that we think intentionally about how we construct those messages within the scope of the fact that they're always being read in certain ways. Yeah. So I was going to give an example, but I don't know if some of you know the artist Saya Woolfolk. She does a lot of really incredible installation work, and she imagines these possible worlds where people, individuals, human beings are not race, they're not gender, they're just these beings. She calls them empaths. They just sort of feel. It's kind of like Octavia Butler, thinking about possible worlds beyond the way that we understand race and identity in this moment. She creates these large-scale installations, but her latest project took place in the Fulton Terminal, the new Fulton Terminal downtown, the train station. So she was asked to create a movement piece that called upon the solar energy in the terminal. There's an Oculus. The consumer energy, there's a mall. The commuter energy, people are going back and forth in the trains, and it's on ancestral burial grounds. Now, historically, Saya's work, the way that the empaths perform is their faces are painted blue. They're completely blue, and they sort of represent this idea that these beings are not raced, and you don't know what they are. They're just feeling compassionate human beings. So Saya asked me to choreograph this piece in the Fulton Terminal, which was meant to disrupt the space and call upon these energies. And she never, so I was brown-skinned black woman, was performing this piece, and two other very brown-skinned young women who were part of the choreography. And at one point, and you know, we were thinking about what should we do to indicate that we're activating these spaces and we're transforming that space. But I said to Saya at one point, does it matter that, why are we not painted blue? Right? Does that matter or not? Like, and then part of me felt like, well, shouldn't we be? I feel like I'm protected out here, like in the middle of Fulton Terminal, because it was not marked as a performance. We were just literally in the terminal as people were trying to get where they were trying to go. We were on the escalators. People were brushing past. It was an unprotected space. I'm trying to get at your question. So, and I was thinking, well, in part, I was angry at first, like, why don't we get to be painted blue? Right? If we are really these empaths in this space, why are we? And she was like, no, you should. I don't want you to be painted. So we had like the little dots, and I was thinking about what. And so her reasoning behind that is just, I just want you to be yourself in the space. Like you can embody the idea of this empath without transforming your skin or transforming your body. And I thought about how that was both powerful and infuriating in some ways, and pushed me to think differently about the possibilities of moving beyond race. And I don't know, that's a question for you all, what you think about that, but we were these clearly marked black women in this public space in ways that had not necessarily happened in her similar work before. But in your question just now, I'm reminded of that. So that intentional choice, was that intentional choice, did it create a different understanding of the possibilities of both acknowledging race and moving past it? Or not, I don't know, but that's an example that I think provides us with the way that we can think of the opportunity in seeing and moving beyond, if that's...
Or not.
Or not.
Or do we even have to? Can we not embrace who we are, the three brown ladies?
I don't think we get to embrace who we are in those contexts with the same balances.
You can even get on the escalator.
Right, that's another question. Right?
Yeah.
So I have an anonymous question here, and it says, how would you like all of us in this room to continue the conversation you began to see? Is there change you would like to see, and how can we be the agents of change? What are our action items?
Yeah, I love that. I was thinking about when in various creative projects I've worked on, to me, in the way that we choose to work together, and the way that we create a process and what we present to the community is like a little microcosm of an experiment of the way we want the world to be. And I feel like as artists we can imagine worlds, but if we can't work together and stick through several months process because we get so infuriated with one another and that we can't even come up with a process to create a piece, then how do we expect anything else to change if we can't even do that? So I guess in whatever community, whatever projects you form, to be thinking about process and what kind of, when you create a process, I think about this as a teacher and doing pedagogy, thinking about pedagogy, what kind of knowledges that have been subjugated are allowed to emerge from the type of process you create. So is it a process that, in which new things can happen, in which ways of thinking and being can emerge, or is it one that tries to contain it? Or is there a balance? What is the relationship amongst the people? I think that those are like I think experiments in like that everyone can take on in your artistic practice, your teaching practice, whatever, your life practice.
I think action steps are really important, and they force us to be concrete about what is at stake and what we need to do. And I'm going to give some things that I think are really important. I think it's always imperative, even though I was just talking about the dangers in focusing on struggle and protest. But I do think that we have to continue to demand that, and I'll just use concert dance as an example, that I can even use Alvin Ailey's dance company. I'm just using it as an example that I do feel like we require a little bit more courage because, and I'll speak for myself, because when I think about, let's think about how we can talk about intersected identities or how we can create more space. I'm more likely, and I'm just gonna be more likely to try to do that in an experimental space with people who look like me or people that I feel comfortable and safe having this conversation with. But I'll leave that other those, these very lucrative financially, which is important to think about, and visible mainstream areas where we go to watch dance and where we name a certain aesthetic expertise in dance, that space can stay as it is. Like, how do we push back against those places that we, in our minds, we're like, but that's just never going to change? And how do we imagine the possibility of change happening in those spaces as we continue to generate and create new vocabulary and new practices that we can then bring to these other spaces? And I just want to pick up a point that you made earlier, Carrie, that I think is really important. What are you showing up with, right? And we have a lot that we're showing up with, right? And so what does it mean to, I always think about working simultaneously, working in several different contexts at once. How are we over here doing our thing and creating new ideas and experimenting and failing and trying again? And then how do we continue to push back against these other spaces? So it's not an either or. So I would say our action steps are continue to be brave in spaces where we can feel safe to fail and create new understandings and new ideas as we continue to push back in these other ways, in spaces that we might not feel so brave in.
So we have maybe 3 minutes left. So, yep, we have time for one more question.
Well, this better be good.
And short.
You mentioned a number of times the kinds of conflict and struggle and stress of the kind of collaboration that you've been engaged in. And I was fascinated by that, but also made curious. Could you give us a couple examples of what kinds of things actually cause those conflicts, and perhaps how they were resolved, but it would help me understand at a more specific level what you were talking about as ways of illustrating the point.
I think that I tried to provide the example of when creating a piece about how we address shame. So there was this real idea of going to that place that is shameful and describing it in as much detail as possible and pushing it back. And because we were talking about specifically about women's bodies and about the founding of gynecology and how experiments were done on disabled slave women. So we were talking about very specific body parts. And so when we were experimenting with talking about those things, and it did not resonate with our collaborators and with our community members, what happened is they shut down. Like they got quiet, which then made our voices louder. And we weren't even noticing until there was a break, and then there was a convening of everybody who wanted to figure out how do they tell us that we're really offensive. And then coming back to us, and then us having to just stop what we're doing, listen. You can't move in immediately, so we changed directions, we did something else, but that was, and that has informed my thinking. That one moment, I thought I was being brave. I thought I was contributing, and what I realized is I was just railroading I was doing something that was really not useful. And that I had a shared disability identity, but I did not share the racialized, I've had the medicalized experience, but I hadn't had the racialized experience. But in a way I was claiming it. And that was painful. Do you want to give an example?
Yeah, and I have it seems to me that you're talking about like our relationship with the other people that we work with in different communities.
And with
But
each
with
other.
each other, and what I will say for myself, I often felt very uncomfortable, which felt odd to me, and I felt a lot of shame around feeling this shame, that in the ways that we were pushing ourselves to be in our bodies and show our bodies and talk about our bodies did not feel empowering to me, did not feel courageous. I felt extremely vulnerable in a way that I did not in that moment think was generative of an artistic process or as an intervention. And so I found it odd because I am a dancer and I think that I'm in my body, but in that space of talking about what happened to Anarcha and other disabled slave women as they were experimented on by the father of gynecology, there were things that were triggering me that were beyond my identity as a dancer, that were beyond my ability as a scholar and to engage those stories. And it was very visceral, and it was tied to memories that I didn't even know that I had, right? And so that became a moment where I not only felt shame of to perform in that way, but ashamed that I felt that shame.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you all for being here tonight, for listening, participating, and thank our panelists for going to those places and languaging those experiences in a way that we think will be helpful as we go forward.
Thank you so much for
Thank you. And I do have just a couple of closing remarks, with many thanks to Alice and Amy and Carrie for all they brought to us this evening. First, I just want to say that we hope you will continue with us in advancing disabled artists and dance making by disabled artists and the conversation this evening. You can visit our website, dance.nyc, to learn more about our research, our programming, the work that we're doing in this space. You can become a registered user of our website to post information about your own activity, and members of our team will be available tonight to help you register if you'd like to do so. You can also register for future events on our website, and the next event in this series will be a conversation with choreographers and dance educators David Dorfman and Victoria Marks, and that's on October 17. On our website, you'll also find the application for our Disability Dance Artistry Fund that I mentioned earlier this evening, and you can direct questions to Disability NYC Dance at dance.nyc. And then finally, I am very pleased to announce the date for Dance NYC's next annual symposium, and that will be March 5th, 2017, and registration will open this week. We are using as an organizing device for the symposium cultural planning, recently legislated by the New York City Council and led by a team that I see here in the back of the room. This is, in many ways, a call to action. We will, among other topics, continue to mine those brought up in our discussion tonight, and we believe it is necessary that disabled artists and disabled New Yorkers are part of the process and the implementation of this plan to ensure that New York has an equitable cultural policy and that disabled artists flourish. Registration is open. There is early bird registration, and we're also partnering with colleague art service organizations mission-focused on addressing racial equity and the integration of disabled artists and offering discounts to their memberships. Kaisha Johnson, Women of Color in the Arts, welcome, is one. Art Beyond Sight, Inclusion in the Arts, Asian American Arts Alliance, Indo-American Arts Council, and the International Association of Blacks in Dance. So we hope that you will join us for all the events we have leading up to the symposium, and then thank you again for being with us. And please join us now for a reception downstairs. We'll have the place until 8. you can continue the conversation there. Oh, and I see everyone's passing out. We have an online survey. I'm told it takes only 3 minutes to help us improve our events. Only 3 minutes. I think there's a link, an online link that I'm missing up on the slide, but people are also handing around paper copies and their baskets that you can put your surveys in when you exit. Thanks, everybody. Yes, Ken.
I heard you say you have a space until 8, but just for the general population here. My name is Tim Cullen. I'm the executive director here at New York Live Arts. Our building is a public space and our lobby is open until 10 p.m. And so if there are people that want to, I don't believe we have the bar open this evening because we don't have a show in the theater. And there's a reception that I think is put on by Dance NYC. However, after the Dance NYC reception winds down, if there's anybody that wants to remain in the lobby to continue a conversation that you've gotten into, please feel free to stay in the space until 10 o'clock.
You can continue the conversation until 10 o'clock in the lobby. Thank you all for being here.